Pestravka, Tavorsky District, Saratov Oblast, Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Try fitting all that on an envelope. Wednesday, 12 April 1961, 10:55 a.m. local time. Anna Takhtarova, wife of the local forest ranger, her 5-year-old granddaughter Rita Nurskanova, and their brown spotted calf, whose name has sadly been lost to history, are on their way back home from a morning spent planting potatoes at the local agricultural collective because, yay, communism! When up ahead in the distance they see a strange orange-skinned creature with a large white head struggling with what appears to be some sort of gigantic bedsheet. Anna and Rita start to slowly back away, and as they prepare to turn and flee, screaming for their lives, the creature notices them and begins wildly waving its arms, seemingly beckoning them to come forward, which they proceed to do. When they get close enough to be within earshot, they are satisfied that this is actually a man in an orange suit with a white helmet. The thing he was struggling with was a parachute, and though he can't yet be heard intelligibly by his discoverers, he does seem to be speaking Russian underneath that helmet. I just can't figure out what he means by these hand gestures. Oh, wait. I know. I've got it. I think he's asking us to help him remove his helmet, which little Rita then proceeds to do. And though Anna and Rita don't know it yet, they have just become historical figures, for they are the first 2 people ever to meet a space traveler. For the man they have just encountered is none other than Senior Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Air Force, who has just completed history's first human space flight, as well as the first orbital flight and the first multi-orbital flight aboard the craft that will become known to history as Vostok 1, and the first words he spoke to these 2 random peasants were these, and this quote always makes me smile. "Don't be afraid, I am a Soviet citizen like you, who has descended from space, and I must find a telephone to call Moscow." And he wasn't lying about the urgency of calling Moscow, for he had just landed 200 miles short of where he was supposed to land, and there were hundreds of recovery personnel at the intended landing site who by this time were starting to fear that there had been some terrible malfunction on re-entry and their cosmonaut was well and truly dead. But even in spite of the urgency of the situation, finding a telephone to call Moscow was going to be easier said than done, and extricating Yuri Gagarin from the clutches of the villagers for whom he was now a local hero, that was going to be no simple matter either. Before he knows it, he's being carried off to the mayor's house for an impromptu feast, presumably made up of borscht and vodka, because that's all you need for a Russian feast, right? Maybe a balalaika player and a couple of chessboards, and call it a party! But anyway, since it's April 12th, or Yuri's Night, as it is popularly known among space flight aficionados, I thought it would be fun to talk about some of the aspects of that story that you don't ever hear about, such as how the hell did the guy manage to escape from the vodka party and find a phone to call Moscow? Well, stay tuned, because the answer lies on the other side of this brief musical interlude. From high atop the battlements of Dacha Kermochin, where we never met a super long Russian place name that we couldn't nail on the second or third try, good evening, Mr. America and Mrs. Amerikova, and all cosmonauts at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your vodka-swilling, chess-playing host. So Yuri Gagarin lands safely in Pestravka, which, as the crow flies, is around 300 kilometers southwest of the place where they were actually trying to land him, the error owing to a computer malfunction that caused Vostok 1's retro rockets to fire a fraction of a second earlier than intended for the deorbit burn, and a fraction of a second is all it takes to produce an error in the hundreds of miles by the time you get down to ground level. Scott Carpenter can tell you all about that. So can Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott on Gemini 8, but for rather decidedly different reasons. Meanwhile, Yuri Gagarin still needs to find himself a damn telephone. Like we said, the people who are supposed to pick him up, they're around 190 miles away from his actual location, and they have got no way of knowing that he is still alive. When he politely asks his new friends if there is a telephone anywhere in the village that he might use, they all laugh uproariously and tell him to have another vodka. A telephone. Yeah, right, that'll be the day. What the hell would we need a telephone for? And here's a good time to digress for just a moment and say, Here is what the difference between freedom and communism looks like. There's no place you could have landed a spacecraft in the United States of America in 1961 and not been able to find a telephone close at hand. But in the Russian village where Yuri Gagarin landed, not only did nobody have a telephone, but they likely had never seen a telephone before. But even though we're a small, isolated village out here in the hinterlands, we do have a local party commissar. Because of course we do. And he is the only guy in town who's got a car. And the nearest telephone is at the airfield up in Engels. Because yes, of course there is a city in Soviet Russia called Engels. It'll only take about 40 minutes to get there, and I'm sure they would be happy to let you use their telephone. Meanwhile, back at the target landing site, nobody is quite sure what to do. There is still no sign of Vostok 1 or Gagarin, but the commander on the scene hasn't been given any instructions on starting a search and rescue operation, and since this is Soviet Russia, you don't do things on your own initiative. You follow your orders to the letter until they are replaced by new orders. So if that means continuing to fly my helicopters in a big damn circle until they all run out of gas and fall from the sky, you bet your sweet ass that's what I'm gonna do. So here's what he decides. I will send a few guys down to the airfield in Engels, since that's where the nearest telephone is, and I'll have them call Moscow and find out if they've got any information about what the hell happened. Now, as it happens, the airfield in Engels is about perfectly halfway between the intended landing site and the actual landing site, and the car with Gagarin arrives at the same time as the car from the landing site. And they say, hey, we know you. You're alive. We're supposed to be finding out if you're dead. And there was much rejoicing. Probably a few vodka shots, too. Maybe a quick game of chess, who knows? Meanwhile, back at the landing site, the local commissar, before leaving to drive Gagarin to the airfield to use the telephone, he instructs the only 3 men that he's got under his command to go and secure the spacecraft and see that no one messes with anything until the Air Force arrives. As night falls and the temperature plunges, it occurs to these guys that nobody has provided them any food or water or shelter or even vodka. The guy who's in charge quickly claims Gagarin's parachute for his own use as a blanket. Then he takes the extremely bold step of climbing into the spacecraft and rummaging around for the onboard survival rations, which he locates and personally devours while laughing at the other guys, who quickly conclude that this situation is rather intolerable. So they resolve to hike down to the village and beg the residents for any provisions that they might be able to spare, leaving the other asshole to his parachute blanket and his space rations. They wind up having to knock on a whole bunch of windows before they finally get directed over to the house of the head of the village council, incidentally the same house where they were having the impromptu Yuri Gagarin vodka party just a few hours earlier that afternoon, who takes pity upon them and sends a car to take them back to the landing site, along with a load of firewood and a couple loaves of bread. Personally, I might have expected more than just bread, but this is Russia after all, and you've still got no blankets, so I hope that fire burns nice and hot all night long. They manage to drift off to sleep, and the next morning they decide they need to make this landing site look a little bit more professional. They run down to the riverbank, collect some sticks, which they insert into the ground, and they tie some bits of parachute string in between them. And before you know it, you have got yourself a roped-off landing site with a perfect 10-meter perimeter. Well, no, sir, of course I didn't climb inside that spacecraft to scrounge the rations. I'd never do something like that. We built this perimeter the moment we got here, and I will personally shoot any son of a bitch who breaches it. And I don't have the faintest idea what happened to those rations, sir. You should ask the cosmonaut. He seems like a hungry type to me. Meanwhile, back at the airfield in Engels, Yuri Gagarin manages at long last to telephone Moscow and inform them that he is not dead, and there was much rejoicing. Cool. So you're sending a plane and I can go home now? Yeah, not so much. I'm afraid you're going to need to cool your heels there for a couple days in the hinterlands, son. You see, this thing is the greatest achievement in the history of the Russian people. Hell, it's arguably the greatest achievement in the history of any damn people. And you are the public face of this thing. And we, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, shall be damned if we're just going to stick you on the next commercial flight out of wherever the hell you are, and have you arrive bleary-eyed at Moscow airport in the middle of the damn night. Oh no, your scrawny little ass is going to remain exactly where it is currently located until we have had a good 48 hours to plan the sort of extravaganza that this occasion demands. It'll be great. You're going to love it. In fact, if you've ever wondered what Karl Marx's ugly-ass face would look like if it was 40 feet tall, you're not going to have to wonder anymore, because that is going to be in your parade, son. A goddamn 40-foot-tall Karl Marx face as I live and breathe. You have my word on it. So, you're sure I can't just come home and kiss my wife and get a good night's sleep? I'm a bit exhausted from the rigors of my space flight, and the people here, they make me drink an awful lot of vodka. Son, I'm afraid you don't understand how this all works. You are a hero of the Soviet Union now. You are probably the hero of the Soviet Union. If Peter the Great and Catherine the Great had a baby and it was raised by Marshal Zhukov, that would be you. You are not a man anymore. You can get that notion out of your smiley little head right now, son. You are the personification of every single thing the Russian people like about themselves and aspire toward in the future. You are a national institution. Nay, you are an international institution. We're going to send you on a world tour that would put Keith Richards in freaking rehab. The Yankees have got their John Wayne, and we've got our Yuri Gagarin. That is who you are now. That is your statue. Forever. Better not screw it up. See you in Red Square Friday. And look, all joking aside, it probably was before the end of that first phone call to Moscow when Yuri Gagarin realized his life was about to change in ways that he had never contemplated and might not have been necessarily okay with. But you're a Soviet military officer. An opinion is something that you don't get the luxury of having. It was made clear to him right off the bat that he wouldn't be flying again, and not just in space. They didn't even let him fly jets anymore. The world didn't know that, of course. They just saw a young guy with a winning smile who was loved by everybody who met him. He spent a couple years traveling the world and being feted and celebrated and fawned over by all of the great and the good and all the best people in the world. But the smiles got a little bit more forced as the tour dragged on. The drinking turned from a social necessity into a coping mechanism. Now let's face it, when you're not yet 30 years old and you're trained to be a man of action, a fighter pilot, and a cosmonaut constantly existing on the knife edge of instant death, and then the same employer who sent you up to traverse the heavens puts you on the cocktail party circuit and stops letting you do anything remotely hazardous, if there is a recipe for taking a vibrant, vigorous young man and turning him into a hollowed-out husk of himself, that is about what it looks like. And if you haven't taken the message yet, let's just say the last half dozen years of Yuri Gagarin's life, well, they make for some pretty goddamn depressing fare. They kept him on the active cosmonaut roster, of course, just to keep up the illusion that he hadn't been forcibly retired, but he raised hell about it. He said, look, for Christ's sake, I can accept the fact that you'll never let me fly again, but could I at least get a backup assignment so I can sort of pretend to be an actual cosmonaut instead of a dumb politician like you're trying to make me into? And they acquiesced, somewhat surprisingly. Midway through 1966, Yuri Gagarin is announced as the backup for Soyuz 1, piloted by his best friend Vladimir Komarov. With Vostok 1, the Gagarin flight, let's call things what they are. The Soviets drew an inside straight flush with that flight. There were a dozen different ways it should have ended in a ball of flaming death. But in the end, they got a man up, they got 3 revs, and they got him back down. Can't take that away. They achieved it, and they achieved it first, and it took us 3 manned flights to match the mission parameters of their first manned flight. So respect where respect is due. But if there's anything we know about the universe, it's that you can only tempt fate for so long before it takes a nice, meaty bite out of your hindquarters. And the Soviets were tempting all kinds of fate in their overwhelming zeal to do every aspect of human spaceflight before we did it. First dog, first man, first woman, first orbit, first multi-orbit, first 2-man flight, first EVA, and that's where the list ends, because Alexei Leonov's EVA in 1965 was the last of the firsts for the Soviet space program. Soyuz? Well, I don't need to tell you about the Soyuz. They are still flying the damn thing today. It's the most successful and reliable space vehicle in history. But it was not ready for its prime-time close-up in the spring of 1967, and everybody knew it. The party bosses knew it, the engineers knew it, and the prime and backup crew members, they damn well knew it. You see, the next first on the horizon was the first three-man flight, and the Soviets thought they had already lost that part of the race. Apollo 1 had been scheduled to fly with a three-man crew of Grissom, White, and Chaffee in February of 67, but the Soyuz was nowhere near as close to being operational as the Mark 1 Apollo spacecraft was. But then, Grissom, White, and Chaffee burned to death on the pad during the plugs out test on 27 January, and the whole Apollo program is paused indefinitely for an investigation to be conducted. For the Soviets, well, hell, we're back in the game now, boys. And now we've got a window where we can get the first three-man flight up before the Yanks do it, but we're not going to do a three-man flight right away. Because, frankly, we don't have that much confidence in our spacecraft. That's why Soyuz 1 is just a nice, easy one-man check ride. We'll go up, we'll do a few orbits, we'll come back down, easy peasy. But Yuri Gagarin knows this spacecraft is a death trap in its current state of development, and it's likely to kill any man who attempts flying in it. He also realizes he is probably the only man in the country who can say this out loud without being bundled off to the gulag, or worse. So he says it. And he's ignored. And he says it again, and he's ignored a second time. Then he tries to go outside the chain of command, which is about the most suicidal thing you can do as a Soviet citizen. But they just sort of pat him on the head and send him on his way. Naughty, naughty little Yuri. We'll overlook this little fit of pique, but you better shut up and start being a good communist if you know what's good for you. And then we get all the way to launch day, 23 April 1967. Gagarin is certain this flight is going to end in tragedy if it gets flown. And he's not much in the mood to watch his best friend get killed, but he's only got one possible avenue of recourse remaining. He shows up at the pad on the morning of the launch and demands to be dressed in his flight suit because he's going to fly the damn mission himself. And since he's a colonel now, there's nobody around to outrank him, and so the ground crew guys just do what they're told. Eventually, though, the higher-ups arrive on the scene, as does Komarov, and Gagarin is forced to stand down, which he knew that was going to happen, of course. He didn't think they would actually let him fly the mission in Komarov's place, but he did hope that if he made this big display on the morning of the launch, then maybe, just maybe, that might cause his concerns to be taken more seriously, and maybe they'll scrub the launch. But Yuri, dear Yuri, can you not read a calendar? We are coming up on the 1st of May, and on our most important national holiday, we want to celebrate the successful first flight of the spacecraft that will carry the Soviet flag to the surface of the moon. So they launched Vladimir Komarov into space, and just as he and Gagarin had both feared, the mission was 100% shit show from the word go. The first thing to be done was deploying the solar arrays on which the spacecraft relied for the functioning of its navigational instruments, but they only got one of the things out. By the 13th orbit, Komarov has lost all ability to control the orientation of the vehicle, and Mission Control decides to call the whole thing off. But here's the thing about trying to fire your retros for your deorbit burn when you've got no control of your spacecraft orientation. You don't have the faintest idea what's going to happen when you fire them. In this case, it was a great bit of flying on Komarov's part that he managed to eyeball the thing just right, close as he could, and fire his retros when the orientation of the craft was more or less where he wanted it to be. But here's the thing about uncontrolled deorbit burns. While you may be able to pull off the actual deorbit part of the equation, you are still likely to be in a non-advantageous place when it is time to deploy the parachutes. And that's what did Komarov in at the end of things. The drogue chute never deploys correctly, and then out comes the main chute. It gets tangled up in the risers from the drogue chute. And long story short, Soyuz 1 and Vladimir Komarov impact the ground at a speed of 40 meters per second. Yuri Gagarin, who as the backup cosmonaut is serving as the Capcom, has to sit and listen as his best friend hurtles towards certain death in a doomed, broken spacecraft that was only launched so it could land in time for May Day. And all of those who knew Yuri Gagarin say that he was a permanently broken man after that. As punishment for the display he had put on the morning of the Soyuz 1 launch, Gagarin was permanently and publicly and forcibly retired from the Cosmonaut Corps. They stuck him in a classroom teaching cadets And he makes the most of his extra time by earning his doctorate in aerospace engineering in 1968. Eventually, he earns enough good behavior points that his superiors decide to give him the chance to be returned to active flight status. In airplanes, mind you, not spacecraft. And he winds up getting killed during his first check ride with his flight instructor at the controls. It is a natural byproduct of state secrecy in a place like the Soviet Union that there have been all manner of wild conspiracy theories surrounding Gagarin's death in the decades since it happened, but there's no particularly good reason to believe it wasn't just a dumb accident owing to mechanical failure or pilot error like 99% of all airplane crashes. Yuri Gagarin was a great man. Full stop. Not many men who die before the age of 35 can be assured of their name being recorded for all time in the annals of human greatness, but he is one who can be. Who else is even on that list? Alexander the Great? And it remains true, as it may for all time, that Yuri Gagarin's is the greatest achievement in the history of the Russian people. Does it matter that he had no operational control of the vehicle and the whole flight was done on autopilot? No. It matters not in the slightest. Does it matter that his flight didn't qualify as a completed space flight per the rules of the International Aeronautical Union? That's a more complicated question. All the way from the day of the flight until the fall of the Soviet Union, the official story was that Gagarin had landed together with his spacecraft. Only in the 1990s is it revealed that, not quite. He ejected and landed separately by parachute, which means it is not a completed spaceflight by the letter of the law. But since it's Yuri's night, let's give him a free pass on that one, too. I'm feeling generous. He is still the first man in outer space and the first man in orbit. On our side, it took Al Shepard, Gus Grissom, and John Glenn, 3 great Americans, to match what that little bastard did on his one little autopilot flight, and more power to him, I say. Thanks very much for watching. Have a pleasant tomorrow. See you next time. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.